far more reasonable.
This is such a difference from the 102 class I take, where I stand up there and I stare at them and they keep talking. You all get quiet. Wow, this is great. It's my pleasure to introduce today's colloquium speaker, Dr. Antonietta Capotondi from NOAA and the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, which, contrary to what you all think, that's actually where I did my postdoc, not at NCAR. So, Antonietta comes to us today from NOAA. She did her bachelor's at University of Pisa and then did her PhD at MIT, the joint program with Woods Hole. And she's been at NOAA pretty much ever since. Pretty close?
Pretty close.
Pretty close.
Yeah.
There may have been some time at NCAR in there as well.
That was for my thesis.
Yes, thesis with Bill Holland and Paola. Rizzio.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Antonietta works on a lot of different Pacific-focused things, including El Nino Southern Oscillation, its changes with global warming, its diversity in a present climate. In addition, she works on how the ocean impacts phytoplankton and biological impacts. And then the third topic that she works on the most is tropical Pacific Decadal Variability, which we will hear about today. She's written dozens of papers, and she's won some pretty cool awards, including the NOAA Bronze Medal Award. And what I'm most excited about is she is this year's 2024 CIRES lecturer at AGU. So I'm very excited to watch that this year.
Thank you.
So without further ado, Antonietta Capotondi.
Thank you so much. I will start by challenging myself with the microphone. Okay, can you hear me? And we also have a point.
That is not the pointer.
Oh, okay.
But if you would want to, if you prefer a physical stick.
Ah, okay, that
Be careful
sounds
not
good.
to drag that off.
Okay, that's true. Perfect. Okay, so anyway, thanks again for the invitation. Thanks everybody for being here. And so as Liz said, this is a topic that I've been working on, in fact, for more than 20 years, on and off, not all the time. And there are still aspects, as we discussed today, that still need to be understood. It's also a topic that, just in the broader community, has received varying attention. So in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a lot of activity on Pacific decadal variability in general, and tropical as a special case. And this was related to the big climate shift that happened in the 1976-77. So the big 1976-77 climate shift and all the ecological and other societal impacts. And then other things came about. We discovered that ENSO was diverse, and so we wanted to understand that. But recently there has been a renewed interest in decadal variability and tropical Pacific decadal variability, mainly for two reasons. One is that there is need for decadal prediction, so the decadal time scale is appearing as an important time horizon for a lot of manager type applications. And the other thing is that decadal variability is very strongly intertwined with climate change, and we will see a little bit, make a little mention in this talk. And so it's very important to understand the relative contribution of these two components also for better understanding future projections. So I think just a very schematic outline here, so I will try to kind of justify why tropical Pacific decadal variability is important, and kind of describe show the basic characteristics, and then discuss some of the oceanic mechanisms that have been developed over the years, and in particular focus on the processes that are wind-driven. And then I also, hopefully I have the time also to discuss possible Atlantic influences on this on TPDV, on tropical Pacific decadal variability. So why is tropical Pacific decadal variability important. So there are a lot of studies that have shown a strong correspondence, a strong connection, I would say, between precipitation variability over the US with tropical Pacific sea surface temperature. This is actually from an old paper where we were correlating here the low frequency precipitation variability in this region, in the Great Plains, with sea surface temperature worldwide. And so from observations and also from, again, just showing four CMIT model. And in all cases, we see a strong Pacific component, the decadal time scale, both in the tropics, particularly kind of in the tropics. So TPDV, or what's going on in the tropical Pacific, can be important for precipitation. Also, TPDV is associated with modulation of ENSO characteristics. What we are seeing here is sea surface temperature in the equatorial band shown as function of longitude and time. And here I have a tropical Pacific decadal variability index. And you can see that during period where this index is mainly positive, so this will be a warm decadal phase for the tropical Pacific, we tend to see more red, so more El Nino activity, positive phase of ENSO. And also we see that some of the events are very intense and tend to reach all the way to the eastern Pacific, so they are more eastern Pacific events. During negative phases, actually there is more La Nina activity, and I think the El Nino events that we see, they tend to be weaker and tend to be more in the central Pacific. Of course, the relationship of decadal variability with ENSO is a very controversial one, because in the tropical Pacific, ENSO is such a strong mode of variability and also so variable in itself that one can think that if you take a decadal average of these varying ENSO characteristics, we have a residual that can be viewed as decadal variability. Independent studies that I've been part of seem to indicate that tropical-extratropical interactions are very important for decadal variability in the tropics, implying that maybe ENSO is not the only source of decadal variability, and actually maybe other influences can create these low-frequency variations that then can modulate ENSO. But I think the interaction is still another important topic of discussion. And then finally, there has been, like, I'm just showing this figure from the study by Kuzaga and Shi in 2013. They looked at the rate of change of global average surface temperature. So the black line is from observation. And as you can see, after, I'm showing you, I have put the years here, but they have disappeared. That anyway, after 2000, there was this slowdown in the rate of change of the global average surface temperature, and this was a very controversial period known as the hiatus period. So if they take just a historical simulation, this blue line, of course, that continues, the trend continues growing, but when they prescribe, they use a pacemaker experiment to constrain the tropical Pacific sea surface temperature to the observation, they found that this red line actually seemed to follow the observed time series much more closely, and in particular also shows this slowdown of warming during the after 2000. And so kind of indicating the important role of the tropical Pacific and this low frequency variation in affecting the global climate. So how does tropical Pacific look like? We can kind of first look at try to do a statistical characterization of this variability using empirical orthogonal function analysis. So what we are seeing here is the pattern of the leading EOF of decadal sea surface temperature anomalies, so period longer than 7 years after the trending the data. And this, so the EOF is computing in the tropics, so as shown by this dashed line, and then the decadal anomaly are regressed over the corresponding principal component over the entire basin. And we can do the same thing at interannual time scales by just choosing like the 2 to 7 year period. And what we find in this case, of course, is the well-known ENSO pattern. And as you can see, and as was, I think, already pointed out many years ago, so these two patterns, the pattern of decadal variability is somewhat ENSO-like, at least in the tropics, but there are also some notable differences. So here the largest anomalies are found in the Central Pacific, and also there is a broader meridional scale relatively to ENSO. And another way of looking at the major patterns of variability, just to actually take decadal differences of quantities involved in this variability. So here what we see in the shading are sea surface temperature differences between two periods, the 1999-2014, which was a cool period, so a negative phase of this variability, and the 1984-1999 period, which was instead a warm period. And the contours here are actually the contours of the statistical pattern that we have seen before. So this specific phase transition from positive to negative is actually very consistent to what we find with the UF analysis. And so one thing that I didn't emphasize before is that although we are looking in the tropics, clearly this is a basin-wide pattern, which is also reminiscent of basin-wide modes of variability, like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation or the Inter-Pacific Decadal Oscillation, with anomalies that are on opposite side in the central western mid-latitude. So this is the surface temperature. But there are also differences that are associated, that involve atmospheric variables. So what we see here is the shading is for sea level pressure, and then we saw the arrows are the surface winds. So the largest anomalies in sea level pressure are mainly at high latitude, but they have also some subtropical expression that also influences the surface winds in the tropical band. And for this particular transition where we go from positive to negative and we end up with this kind of more La Nina-like type of state, we have stronger winds in the tropical band, which would favor this type of conditions. Apart from the surface, we also have important subsurface features associated with this variability. And oops, I'm losing my it's the scarf that came off. So it's not a stable system. Okay, so what we are seeing here now, focusing on the tropics, are the differences between the same two periods in sea surface height. So sea surface height is also a surface variable, but it's actually strongly connected with the upper ocean heat content. And we can see that there is a striking asymmetry in the pattern of sea surface height with the negative anomaly, so lower sea surface height, and from the point of view of the ocean thermocline, would be like shallower thermocline, and then in the Western Pacific, and especially at this latitude which are off the equator, we actually see a larger, very large sea surface height signature. And if we look in the subsurface, in fact, and now these lower panels, they show temperature anomaly differences between the same two periods. And the left panel, the anomalies are averaged west of the dateline, and they're shown as a function of latitude and depth. And here they are averaged east of the dateline. But we have very large anomaly, kind of up to 1.5 degrees C in the subsurface. And it's interesting to see that this anomaly actually tend to be found around this specific isotherms which define the mean thermocline. And so suggesting that this anomaly in the subsurface, where there are large vertical gradient in the ocean, may be due to just the vertical movement of the thermocline, which can be typical of wave activity. And we will return to that. And I just would like to just take a moment also to compare the same pattern of the surface size differences that we were just seeing, and this was computed for the trended data because I wanted to mainly focus on the internal processes. But if we compare it with the data that have not been trended, so this is from an ocean reanalysis from ORANS5 from the CMWF, we actually see that the pattern is very similar, it's just more intense. And this actually suggests that maybe, if assuming that this trend is of anthropogenic origin, so these anomalies can, this anthropogenic forcing may actually project on the processes that underpin internal variations. And this is an additional motivation to try to understand what these internal processes are. So the need of better understanding these internal processes actually motivated the creation of a working group on tropical Pacific decadal variability in the context of the International Climate Pacific Region Panel. And this working group included several panel members, but also just experts from the broader community with different expertise, both oceanic and atmospheric. And so we had 1 year of monthly meeting and big discussion to try to maybe assess what was the state of understanding, the current state of understanding of this topic. And we, at the end, were able to produce this review paper, which was published a year ago. So this is a way to acknowledge the many contributors to what I'm going to talk today. And you'll see some of the figures also from this paper. Yeah, so in order to understand the processes of decadal variability, it's actually important to also try to review a bit the main climate of the tropical Pacific. So in the near surface, we have a lot of current, mainly in the zonal direction. Some flow eastward, some flow westward. And then close to the western boundary, we have this western boundary current, which actually are not near surface, they are pretty deep. But they kind of close the zonal circulation near the boundary. And the circulation is in balance, in mean state sense, with the atmospheric circulation. And the main element of it is the water circulation with ascending motion in the western Pacific and descending motion in the eastern Pacific, and then this ugly circulation in the meridional direction. But there is also a rich subsurface circulation, which has been highlighted a little more here. So we have this the equatorial undercurrent, which is at the level of the main thermocline. But the part that really has been advocated for the mechanism of decadal variability are these shallow overturning circulations. Which you notice they have a branch, which is a descending branch. This is in the subtropics, where maybe properties, anomalies in the subtropics can actually penetrate, subduct into the ocean interior, and then propagate toward the equator, driven by this pycnocline circulation. So the pycnocline is the layer in the ocean with the very large density gradients. And then they are connected with the equatorial upwelling. And then there is a surface return flow, which is through the surface Ekman layer. So this circulation actually suggests the possibility that remote forcing in the subtropics could change the circulation, change the equatorial upwelling, or bring the anomaly into the equatorial band and change the and affect the equatorial dynamics. So there were two major theories that have been proposed for decadal variability. And so here, actually, we are seeing a two-dimensional view of these subtropical cells. So they are not just simple overturning circles, but anomalies actually propagate into these density surfaces. And what we see in color is the depth of this density surface, which is kind of in the main pycnocline of the ocean. And so in this first hypothesis, which was known as the V-bar T prime, so the mean circulation affecting temperature anomalies, So we can imagine that if in the subtropic there are surface anomalies being created, they could move along the isothermal toward the equator, and you can see here in a zonal behavioral sense, and then at the equator they could be upwelled and maybe change the atmospheric, the ocean's surface temperature, which could affect the atmospheric circulation. And originally people were thinking that then when the surface temperature changes, they change the atmosphere, which then produce anomaly of the opposite side. So this loop has not really been demonstrated, and also the effectiveness of this anomaly to make it to the equator and also to efficiently affect the surface temperature, I think still needs some demonstration. And the second mechanism instead is called the B prime T bar. So in this case, we don't have any temperature anomalies, but we can change the circulation of these cells themselves. So if the cells spin up, become faster, as shown in this particular schematic, then we can increase the upwelling at the equator. That will bring colder temperature in the subsurface to the surface, and cool the surface, and vice versa for the opposite. So if the cells spin down, then we can expect warmer surface temperature. So this theory has been receiving more attention, and starting with this work by McFadden and Zhang. So of course, the two hemispheres are not exactly the same. In the Northern Hemisphere, we have the intertropical convergence zone, which lifts the isopycnals and create these large values of potential vorticity. These colors here are the potential vorticity on the same isopycnal surface. And since the flow tends to conserve potential vorticity to a great degree, so the flow tends to follow potential vorticity contours, and so here it has to go around this potential vorticity barrier, so which is not present in the Southern Hemisphere. So the pathway of the water mass is a little more tortuous, more complicated in the Northern Hemisphere. So to look at, in this study, what McFadden and Zhang did was to try to actually compute from observation the transport of these subtropical cells in the pycnocline and relate it to the equatorial surface temperature. Due to the potential vorticity barrier, they decided to do it at latitudes that are a choke point for the flow in the Northern Hemisphere, and then they choose the same 9 degrees latitude in the Southern Hemisphere just for symmetry. And so what they found are these, so they of course didn't have that many data, so they had to bin the data in several years chunks, and they found that the values of the transport, actually especially after the mid-70s, were decreasing, and this while the equatorial surface temperature were increasing. So they found, at least at this coarse time resolution, they found this intercorrelation. And however, this just because the time resolution of the observation was so coarse, you can see that there is opposite trends of the transport and the surface temperature, but it's hard to really assess phase relationship between the two. So subsequent studies have used model or ocean analysis. And in a recent study that I did, trying to revisit these ideas, kind of putting and also answer some questions, other questions that I had, was that to use this Goda's ocean analysis. And I recomputed all these quantities. So what we see here is the mean meridional velocity in around 9 north and 9 south. So you can see that in the top 50 meters, the flow is positive in the north and negative in the south, so it's poleward flow, that's the Ekman flow in the upper layer. But then if we go below this 50 meters, we see that the flow is actually equatorward, and that's the flow of this pycnocline flow of the subtropical cells. So one can average. In this case, I average from 300 meters to the base of the Ekman layer and then zonally across the basin. And so this is what you find for the transport. So now we have a continuous time series. And so the top two panels show the transport of the two individual latitudes. This is just the anomalies of the transport. and this is kind of the decadal average. And it's interesting to see that actually also at the interannual time scale, you see this variability, which is connected also to ENSO variability. And then what we are interested in is the convergence. So the transport in the south minus the transport in the north, because that's the total volume that would affect the upwelling. And this is shown in this third panel. And the red curve is actually the equatorial surface temperature shown with the scale reversed, just to compare the two. And so there is an excellent correspondence between these two time series. So this is at interannual time scales, but if we just filter the data to the decadal range, we find that also there is a very strong corresponder at decadal time scales. So, however, the largest correlation are found at like 0, so it's hard to explain this in a, so it's hard to view the transport as a causal agent for the changes in sea surface temperatures. And so this opens for really other questions, and I'm going to list them here. So first of all, is there a causal relationship between the interior picnoclide convergence and equatorial sea surface temperature? So we have the right relationship, but how is that actually established? But then the other question is, so we have seen before that there is this very large zonal asymmetry, and so we have seen like one phase transition with large surface temperature anomaly and heat content in the west, and depleted heat content in the east, and the opposite is true for the opposite phase transition. On the other hand, when we look at the transport, we have a zonal average view of it. So how do these two views, the zonally variable and the zonally average, can be explained and rationalized? And then the other thing, which I haven't shown, but in previous studies, people have actually, we have seen before that apart from some tropical cells and zonal current, we also have these western boundary currents, low latitude western boundary currents. And what previous studies have shown is actually that the transport of the western boundary current is anti-correlated with the interior transport and partially offsets it. So this is from one of my papers in 2005, so here the boundary transport is shown with the sign reverse, but you see that there is a very strong connection between the two. And this anti-correlation was also found in observation. This is from Argo data. Of course, the time series is pretty short because Argo only started in the early 2000. But so this is the interior transport in black, and is compared with the Nino 3.4 index. And so, there is this anti-correlation with the surface temperature that we've seen before. But in the Solomon Sea, where they looked at the boundary current, we actually see that they are in phase. So, but if you look at the vertical scale, this is much smaller. So they are anti-correlated, but they are not exactly compensated. And the other question is why there is this anti-correlation, why the boundary transport is different. So anyway, moving forward. So the thing is that if we can think about this, so the transport is changing because the winds are changing, and we actually will demonstrate that in a moment. But so it's not that the transport everywhere is going to change at the same time, at each longitude. So if the winds are changing, the ocean needs to adjust, and the oceans tend to adjust by to wave propagation, which in the ocean tends to be planetary waves or Rossby waves. So one can think that this transport is actually established by these propagated waves. So as the wave propagates by geostrophy, we have that if this is well, let's say sea surface height, but it could also be thermocline depth, one of the quantities that we use to characterize the waves. So as the waves propagate, they alter at each grid point, they alter the zonal slope of the thermocline or the zonal slope of the sea surface height, and this causes a meridional velocity. So they alter also this transport of the subtropical cells. And so if this is the case, so from an equation like this, we actually can estimate the zonal transport in the peak incline just by integrating, wrong buttons, by integrating it across the basin. And so what we find, it's very, very simple math, we can find that the total transport based on the sea surface height metric can just be expressed as the difference in sea surface height across the basin, eastern boundary minus the western boundary. So this is a very simple conceptual idea. Does it work? So we can actually test it in this analysis where we have everything. So here the black lines are the same transport that we have seen before. And the blue line now are the one estimated from these equations. So of course we have to make a judicious guess about this age because the underlying assumption is that we have a two-layer system. But with reasonable values, we can certainly see that we can reconstruct most of the transport with a very large correlation between the two. So this is just the two latitudes, so then we can, individual latitudes, we can ask, is that true also at other locations in the tropics? And so if we repeat the same analysis for over the tropics, maybe just excluding the equatorial band, we find that the correlation between these two transports is actually about 0.8 over most of the tropics, from like the boundary of the equatorial band all the way to 20 meters. So, so the sea surface temperature gradients across the basin provide a very good estimate of the transport computed directly from the meridional velocities. And so the zonal transport is consistent with this Rossby wave adjustment. But then the question is, are these Rossby waves, or to what extent are this adjustment process induced by the local winds? So remember that people, when they introduced this mechanism, they were thinking that things off the equator would affect the equatorial thermocline. And so this actually can be also estimated relatively simply just by using this 1.5 layers shallow water model, which is in practice a Rossby wave model. So this says that the rate of change of this sea surface height, and here stands for model, simple model, is due to this term, which is just propagation due to the waves. CR is the phase speed of the oceanic Rossby waves, and then there is a forcing term, and then there is a precipitation. And this can actually has a very simple solution, which can be written analytically, although it needs to be estimated numerically. And this is what the solution looks like at this latitude, and this is what the surface height evolution, this is longitude and time, directly from the Goldasser analysis look like. So, of course, it's not identical, but it's really captured most of the variability that was in the original analysis. But also, we can do the same thing that we did before. We can use now this simple model estimate of the surface height to estimate the transport. And what we find is that, again, the black line is the transport computed directly from the velocity, and the red line is the one estimated from this Rossby wave reconstructed sea surface height. And again, I think it's so I have to, for honesty's sake, I have to admit that the comparison at 9 North is not as good, but not bad either. I mean, it's just not as good. And I think it could be that at 9 North, since when, this model is forced with this Ekman pumping, which is the curve of the wind stress. And it's at the latitude where we have a strong wind convergence over the IPCC, so it could be that the resolution of the data may introduce inaccuracy. So that has not been solved, but it's not. I mean, it's still consistent with this group. Okay, so we've seen then that the adjustment process driven by local wind forcing are responsible for the transport changes. So these Rossby waves tend to accumulate westward. And so they move westward, they create this large SSH anomaly in the western part of the basin, consistent with the subsurface anomaly that we have seen. And at the same time, as they move westward, they also change this transport. So this is how all the pieces fit together. So the last piece that we need to clarify is the western boundary transport. Why is that of the opposite sign? So we go back to this picture of the changes in sea surface height. So we've seen here that the transport in the interior is equatorward for this transition. So equatorward, larger upwelling, colder sea surface temperature. But if we look at this pattern of SSH near the boundary, actually very close to the boundary, the gradient of SSH is of the opposite sign. So across the basin, the gradient is negative, but here the gradient is positive, and so it's so the transport is going to be positive in the northern hemisphere, where F is positive, and negative in the southern hemisphere, where F is negative. So I think it's the different sign, the western boundary current also is a consequence of this adjustment, and the fact that these waves that move at these time scales, and on long time scales, these waves that move toward the western boundary, toward the westward, they affect the western boundary currents and change their transport in the opposite way that they do at the interior. So some pieces of the puzzle are coming together, but of course we are looking at ocean processes which are mainly wind forced. So the other question is, what is the origin of the anomalous wind forces that causes these decadal variations? And so there are different possibilities. One, as people were thinking in the original theories, is that you have wind anomalies, that they change the circulation, change the sea surface temperature, and then the sea surface temperature forces wind anomaly of the opposite sign. And again, that has not been shown in observation, and it's very hard to prove because the climate system is very noisy and finding the signal may not be easy. But the other is tropical extratropical interactions. For example, we know that there are processes like the seasonal footprinting mechanism that create sea surface temperature anomalies in the subtropics, which are also associated with wind anomalies. And they can then affect the equator, and then there will be a feedback of the equator and those anomalies, and redden the spectrum of these anomalies. And then the third hypothesis is the influence from the other ocean. So I think for the sake of time, I'm going to actually focus on this and specifically look at the effect of the tropical Atlantic, on the possible effect of the tropical Atlantic on the tropical Pacific. Of course, when we are looking at interaction between different parts of the climate system, those are very complex to understand. In fact, in terms of Atlantic-Pacific interactions, a lot of studies at decadal timescales, but also at interannual timescales, a lot of studies have been conducted using so-called pacemaker experiments, where so we want to, let's say we want to know how much the Atlantic, the tropical Atlantic can affect the Pacific, so we can nudge or constrain the tropical Atlantic sea surface temperature to look like observations and see the effect on the Pacific. So theoretically, like a warm tropical Atlantic can be expected to give rise to a rising motion, so divergent motion and off, and then subsidence in the central equatorial Pacific, which would strengthen the trade winds and give rise to a Pacific anomaly of the opposite side of the Atlantic. This is from a paper by Tucholsky et al., but there have been many studies in the same spirit. And here on the right, we see in the top panel, I think the Atlantic 3 index is an index of sea surface temperature in the eastern equatorial Atlantic. And so here the sea surface temperature globally in the winter are regressed against this index in the summer. That's when the Atlantic Nino anomalies tend to peak. And so they find that this warm anomaly in the Pacific, in fact, related to this cold anomaly, the Atlantic are related to the cold anomaly in the Pacific. And this is a similar regression, but from a pacemaker experiment where the Atlantic sea surface, in a coupled system where the Atlantic sea surface temperature were nudged to observation to And then if you do the same correlation, you find something similar to what's seen in observation, although in a much weaker amplitudes. So this is very nice, and it's very interesting for understanding how, given certain anomaly in one basin, what you can expect that those anomalies can do to another basin. But it doesn't account for possible feedbacks from the Pacific. So the Pacific is not just there receiving the influence from the Atlantic, but also can affect the Atlantic. But of course, if you prescribe the sea surface temperature, you cannot change anything in your nudge the basin. So to address this problem, at least to start addressing this problem, I think together with my collaborator in ENSO, we have used the linear inverse model, and I know that some of you are working on using it in this department. So in this case, we use like the aura S5 reanalysis from the CMWF, because it actually covers a long period all the way to practical present. So the linear inverse model basically states that X is the state vector, so it's the bunch of variables that we use to describe our systems, and its variation over time is due to mainly two terms. The first term describes the predictable dynamics of the system, so this L is kind of the dynamical operator of the system, and then psi is the stochastic forcing. So we have a system that has internal dynamics but is forced by this stochastic forcing. And our state vector actually includes both variables for the tropical Pacific and variables for the tropical Atlantic. So we kind of separate two basins in the way we construct the state vector. And then this dynamical operator can actually be described in this way, where we specifically specify submatrices in which, like, for example, this LPP describes the internal dynamics, dynamics internal to the Pacific. Similar LAA is dynamics internal to the Atlantic, and then the off-diagonal submatrices indicate the interaction between the two. So this LAP will be the interaction, the influence of the Atlantic on the Pacific, and then PA, the influence of the Pacific on the Atlantic. So if we just rewrite this equation explicitly in this way, we see that the state vector in the Pacific is actually due to both internal dynamics in the Pacific and also to the influence of the Atlantic on the Pacific, plus the stochastic forcing. And similar to the Atlantic, we have the internal dynamics of the Atlantic, but also the influence from the Pacific. So the Atlantic can influence the Pacific in different ways, so there is a direct influence here, but the state of the Atlantic is also due to this term. And so we can actually think about constructing two different limbs, one that we call the no TA limb, no tropical Atlantic limb. We simply zero this term, and we just look at what happens in the Pacific without the Atlantic. Or another one where we zero this term, so the Atlantic still affects the Pacific, but it cannot receive any influence from the Pacific itself, and see what is the relative role of the two. So I think for the sake of time, maybe should I take another 5 minutes? Or?
No, check this.
Okay. Anyway, just very briefly, this is the dominant mode of variability in the Pacific for the three limbs. So the full limb is when everything is coupled. This is when we remove any influence from the Atlantic, and this is when we just remove the influence of the Pacific on the Atlantic. So this is the leading EOF mode. The surface temperature is in shading, and the contours are surface height. And what we see on the right here, which actually makes things easier to see, is the difference between this panel and the top. So this is the effect of removing the tropical Atlantic, and this is the and this is the effect, the difference by removing only the influence of the tropical Pacific on the Atlantic. So we can see that in both cases we have that the influence of the Atlantic is to, so removing the Atlantic influence decreases the amplitude of the anomalies in the Eastern Pacific, but actually increases the anomalies in the Central Pacific, and also in this band that goes from the coastal California toward the Central Pacific, which is kind of the footprint of the North Pacific meridional nodes. We can also look at the spectra. So the blue line is from the original data that we use. We call it observation, but it's an ocean analysis. And then the red line is actually what we obtained from the full limb. So first of all, we see that our limb actually can capture the spectrum very well, and this is reassuring because it means that we are capturing the statistics of the system. And then when we decouple, we see that in the case where the Atlantic is fully decoupled, we have a decrease in power, both at the ENSO time scale, but we have an increase so in both cases actually, we have a decrease in power at the ENSO time scale, but we have an increase in power at the decadal time scale. So actually the influences are different in the two cases. So we can more explicitly look at these different time scales, and this was done by running the limb for many, many years, many thousands of years, which we can run very cheaply, and then looking at the interannual variance. So this is the variance for the full limb, this is the variance for the no-TA limb, and this is the variance that we find when we just remove the tropical Pacific influence of the Atlantic. And we see that when we just remove the Atlantic completely, we actually reduce. So this will be the full minus the no-TA limb, so there is a decrease in the variance in the Eastern Pacific. But the influence of the Pacific on the Atlantic doesn't seem to be that critical. The story is different at decadal time scales. And so in this case, again, this is the variance for the full limb. This is when we decouple completely the two basins, and we can see that now we have a reduction in variance in the tropical Pacific in this case. And however, when we just decouple, and this is even true when we only prevent the Pacific to influence the Atlantic. So how we rationalize these things is that, so if the Atlantic is allowed to influence the Pacific, but the Pacific is not allowed to influence the Atlantic, indeed the Atlantic can affect the Pacific. But the moment when we include the full coupling, but the two-way interactions, then the variance is reduced. And we can go even a little further and then add to these plots that are for surface temperature, include also what differences in the surface height. And we can see that the areas that stand out in terms of changes are really the same those of the equatorial Western Pacific region that we were seeing before in the SSH decadal differences. And now, since we know that those anomalies were associated to wind-driven oceanic Rossby waves, we can, even if we don't have the wind explicitly in this limb, we can infer that probably, as actually we anticipate, these changes are due to modulation of the winds from the Atlantic. Okay, so I think I'm at the conclusion. So I hope I have convinced you that tropical Pacific decadal variability is an important component of the climate system that we must understand. I think also this one hypothesis for decadal variability, the prime T-bar hypothesis, correctly links the interior transport by the subtropical cells to the equatorial surface temperature, but first of all, may not necessarily be the direct cause. I think it's just part of the ocean, the tropical ocean adjustment. And also, unlike hypothesized, or I think this causes into question the original idea that it was the remote forcing that would change the tropics, I think the analysis that I showed seemed to indicate that a lot of those signals are due to the local winds. So of course this doesn't exclude that something also comes from higher latitudes. And so, since I think this hypothesis is mainly associated to wind forcing, I think in order to really close the loop and understand more this variability, we really need to understand the origin of this wind variability. And it could be that the wind variability is just stochastic, and maybe tropical, extratropical interaction threaten that variability. But I think we don't know yet what are the most important factors. So the Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies can indeed seem, at least in this LIM analysis, seem to contribute to tropical Pacific decadal variability in the absence of the Pacific feedback. So it's very important to look at the coupled feedbacks. And so while I think the pacemaker experiment can be useful to understand one direction, I think if we really want to understand what's going on in the climate system, we need to have a better sense of what the two-way interactions looks like. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for the great talk. Is there a student question first? Evan.
Okay, I am going to try to explain a concept to you. I don't know if I'm going to get it across right, but I'm going to try and see if I understand. So that band of anomalies that you see in SST variance and SSH variance.
In the LIM?
When you remove the effects of the coupled processes. Yeah. So that band, in my head, I'm thinking you have oceanic adjustment from Rossby waves that's traveling westward, and the farther away from the equator you go, the slower those waves travel. And so if you have that increase in variance that occurs when you remove the coupling, could that be because the time scale that the waves can travel coherently is longer? So there's a longer period of time where those Rossby waves that are generated in the deep tropics can travel westward before random winds will render them like no longer able to travel. And so in my head, you could have random wind, like a stronger wind forcing that's random coming from the Atlantic that would lead to those waves not traveling as far before they are decoherent.
Yeah.
And then that would lead to that sort of variance pattern.
Yeah. That's a very, very nice question. So the coherence of the winds, as you put it, is actually very important. Mm-hmm. So I think we think in a study that was one of the first studies I did on this topic, where we were seeing all this variability in the tropics. I was looking for subduction of anomaly for the extratropics, and that would decay at some point around, I think, north, as one of our colleagues, Nick Schneider, shown very clearly. But then there was all this variability in the tropical Pacific, which actually at decadal was enhanced at decadal time scale, and that turned out to be associated to Rossby wave propagation. And together with my colleagues, Mike Alexander and Clara Bezer, whose names you may know, we were wondering why these particular latitudes. And so we actually, using that simple Rossby wave model that I showed before, that's a very simple tool, but you can easily change like the amplitude of the Ekman of the forcing, or and try to, or maybe integrate the model only from the Central Pacific or over different domains, trying to see what. So what we found is that from the large variance, especially maybe at the decadal time scale, in fact originated from the coherences of the wave. So those two latitudes were latitudes which are associated to the main axis, the axis of the main trade of equatorial trades, tend to be coherent, meaning that they are very strongly correlated from longitude to longitude. So if you think about this anomaly that propagate westward, and if they continue receiving a similar input at each longitude, they grow much stronger. Instead, if you had, like as you said it, if you had like incoherent signal at different longitude, you may damp them at some point. So that's an important factor. In terms of the Atlantic, I don't think we know very well, but like in this previous studies, this one, So most of this tropical basin interaction rely on changes in the water circulation. And so if that's the case, changes in the water circulation will still impact the trades. And so I don't think that will change the coherences, that may change the amplitude. So maybe the Atlantic may, like in this case, may strengthen the trades, and so give rise to stronger currents, downwelling, Rossby waves, larger anomaly in the Western Pacific. But I don't think, I think that they will still be coherent. That would be my guess. But
Okay.
I think something to maybe to explore.
Okay.
Very good question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. This is very new to me, but so I'm just curious about part of the methods you used. So in the no tropical, no Atlantic cases in the second half of your study, I'm wondering that while you train the limb based on the tropical Atlantic and tropical Pacific SSTs or SSH, are we inherently including the response from exotropics into the tropical ADA and removing those as well, or somehow those are accounted for or balanced for? Like how is that?
That's also a very good question. So I think usually like when you do the limb is based on observation. So, and observations have all the possible interactions. So here we just use the tropics. And as you notice, we just look at the Pacific and the Atlantic. Of course, there is also the Indian Ocean, which is strongly connected. And in fact, this ascending motion in the Atlantic also sheds Kelvin wave toward the Indian Ocean. So I think those effects are implicitly included here. So, and I think to go further, one may consider also other boxes for the extratropics. I think it would be interesting, it would be important to also include the Indian Ocean to see whether these impacts that we're seeing here of the Atlantic on the Pacific actually may be mediated by the Indian Ocean. I think at this point we are just showing the net effect of the Atlantic on the Pacific, but there may be other influences that we are not explicitly modeling that may be important.
So on a follow-up question, I'm also curious about the response that might be happening intra-seasonal. I know that's not
Intra-seasonal?
Yeah, so is there any 2-month or 3-month delayed response that happens between these two basins, or is it something like, and this is coming from a completely naive, like I don't study this one.
No, I think you're perfectly right, though. I think very good intuition there. Yeah, so yes, there is definitely a lag between the two. In fact, as you see here, I didn't do this paper, but the correlation was between the winter season in the Pacific, or winter season everywhere, but the interest was the Pacific, and the summer season in the Atlantic. So there are two major main modes of variability in the Atlantic, in the tropical Atlantic. One is the northern tropical Atlantic mode. I don't know if we use the word mode very casually here, but yeah. And then we have this eastern equatorial Atlantic mode, which is called the Atlantic Nino, and is described as this Atlantic dream, so the equivalent of the Nino index in the Atlantic. And so in fact, there is actually, people have looked at correlation. We also do it in this paper, but there's a different, there's a detour, so I didn't want to take the time. So you can look at the correlation between the Atlantic ENSO indices and, the Pacific ENSO indices and the Atlantic indices. And I think it's pretty robust signature is that El Nino anomalies or ENSO anomalies in the Pacific tend to produce anomalies of the same sign in the northern tropical Atlantic a few months later, like in spring. So if ENSO peaks in the winter, the anomalies in the Atlantic will be in the following spring. And so if you do a lag correlation between the two, which actually this limb captured really well, you can see that there is, the correlation are not 0.8, they're going to be more 0.4, 0.3, so there is still a lot of noise in the system, but you have a statistically significant correlation between like one of the El Nino indices, like Nino 3 or Nino 3.4, and the index for the northern tropical Atlantic. And then there is a negative, so this means that ENSO leads the tropical Atlantic. But there is also a negative correlation with the northern tropical Atlantic leading ENSO, which is a little smaller. And so it has been put into question recently because people said, well, you know, if ENSO induces this anomaly a few months later in the northern tropical Atlantic, and ENSO does its own thing, and in the following winter it changes sign, you would see it as a negative correlation, but it's just a spurious correlation. So actually we use this system to test whether, if we remove the influence for the Pacific, we still see this correlation, and indeed we do. These correlations are not stationary, so there are periods, and it's not clear why. But there are periods in which they are stronger than others, and so we actually tested this. So like after 1990, for example, I think the influence of the Atlantic on the Pacific was stronger. So there is this seasonality, both in ENSO and in the Atlantic modes. Of course, we cannot capture, since this is a stationary limb, we cannot capture the changes in variance, but I think even a stationary limb can capture the phase relationships.
I have kind of a broad question. So I think of winds is in, I mean, I guess it's just kind of like, what is the role of clouds in all these interactions, right? Clouds have a huge impact on the surface heat budget and the SST. And so I guess I'm just wondering, like, does that play a role in any of these dynamics?
Yeah, I don't know. So I'm an oceanographer, and I'm just actually starting getting interested in clouds because, well, I have some friends and collaborators who do clouds, and so I actually, it's a very fascinating topic. So I don't know in decadal timescales how much clouds can affect. We know that they are very important for ENSO. And so, but usually I think heat fluxes in ENSO variability, they can always tend to be a damping there.
Sometimes you can get like bands where it can broaden that structure a little bit, and that may interact with the dynamics in interesting ways. So I'm not really sure. It's a good question,
but it's a good question. Nobody has looked at that. So it will be something that we should talk about to do that. And so also, do you think that the clouds, you know, if we are looking at decadal period, then I guess even if clouds vary on shorter
I think
timescale,
anything
they
that
can
affects SST patterns is going to affect the cloud patterns, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so when
yeah.
you're looking at things like correlations between heat convergence and SST, like clouds are going to play a role in that. That was kind of when I first started thinking about it. Right?
Yeah, I think, well, I think at decadal timescale, probably nobody has done any heat budget.
I know Sarah Larson is starting to look at, in the subtropics, SST cloud feedbacks and the role that plays in enhancing persistence at those, which would project on decadal timescales.
Right, yeah.
So, but more as a process-based rather than a pattern-based analysis. So, but yeah, I think it's a really good question. Yes, they're important. I don't think people have really, you know, in terms of the importance of decadal variability, I don't think it's been fully explored.
But I think clouds, though, so here I made some reference to climate change, but I mainly focused on the internal. I was trying to focus mainly on the internal part, although focusing on the internal was the trend in the data, which is a very simple, maybe inaccurate approach to do it. But I think one important question that we have for the tropical Pacific is the trend. So the observed trend is a cooling trend. So this second period that I was talking about is actually part of that cooling trend, while models show an ENSO, well, I don't like to use that expression, but a warming in the tropical Pacific, especially in the east. And I think, so first people said, well, maybe it's because this cooling trend is just part of internal variability and that model may not have because they are on a different phase than the real world. But it has been lasting for many years now, and so I think people are starting being convinced, so we are getting convinced that this is a real trend. And so when looking at more possible model bias is a big culprit with the clouds, because especially in the subtropical region along the boundary, there is the big biases. So there is actually another working group called Tropics that also involves cloud people who are expert in clouds and radiation experts.
So that was the other question that I was going to ask about this kind of ENSO-like or La Nina-like trend in the Pacific, which I guess is what you were referring to.
Yeah.
All the time,
So
like you
it's
didn't want to refer to
it's a
it.
huge question because it really
Does this
really
shed any light on that?
impacts our ability to have reliable projection, because if that's a real trend and we don't know when it's going to end, and that is strongly affecting ENSO, because like people are projecting this super El Nino increasing in amplitude and frequency in the Eastern Pacific, but a lot of it is also related to the fact that if you have a warmer background state, like the models project, you more easily tend to shift convection to the east. But if instead the El Nino is operating on a colder state, maybe that is not going to happen. So I think a lot of the projection that we have for ENSO are strongly related to the trend. And I think at the moment we don't have an answer. I think now there is work being done. So where like some models run at higher resolution. So another bias or another deficiency, discrepancy that the model has is the warming in the Southern Ocean. So in the real world we see cooling, and most models don't capture that. So if you do one of those pacemaker experiments imposing this cooling in the Southern Ocean, you tend to see a cooling in the southeastern Pacific that then reaches all the way to the equator. But also there have been some model runs done at NCAR and Texas A&M, where they have a high resolution in the ocean that can resolve the oceanic mesoscale eddies. And what they found is that now that the ability to resolve the eddies, at least that's what they think, create this cooling in the Southern Ocean, and also they seem to see a little cooling in the Far Eastern Equatorial Pacific. So these are kind of pointing to possible deficiencies maybe in the ocean models that may affect the erroneous trends in the model. And then, of course, the clouds are another big question mark. People don't know. I think the community seems to think that cloud plays an important role, and the fact that the model don't do very well with clouds can be one of the culprits of this problem, but I don't think there is full understanding.
Thank you.
And that's another thing, those runs you mentioned, they have higher resolution clouds runs, so the improvement could have come from clouds.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily need to be the eddies.
Right, so I think the fact that they see this cooling in the Southern Ocean, which is an area where oceanic eddies are play an important role. So they think that a better resolution explicit resolution of mesoscale eddies, which can capture processes that the parameterization would not capture, and that will give rise to this cooling that from the pacemaker experiment can also affect the equator. So that's kind of the line of thought. But could be other things, exactly. Could be that they maybe have better clouds. And so I don't think that even the model simulation that seem to be more realistic, I don't think that they have been fully analyzed or understood.
Mm-hmm.
There is also they are trying to, of course these are very expensive simulations, and I think now they are up to 10 member ensemble, but of course, I'm not sure how long they are, but I'm sure they are not hundreds of years, and so then there is also a question of sample size and possible, we may just have one member that is luckily let's reduce the right side and maybe, no, but actually I think they are consistent. In particular, there is one member that apparently look like the real world.
So students in the room, there have been like 3 or 4 open areas of research mentioned in the last 2 minutes. Take notes. These are all great areas to look into. Let's thank our speaker one last time.